So I've been given a long list of things to talk about in a rather short period of time. So this is going to be an unapologetically superficial skate across a number of issues, and we can use the discussion and the debate to hone in on the areas that are of most interest to you. And so what I'm going to cover in this topic of financial performance measures is something about the sort of the theory of incentive pay and how it matches up against the reality. We'll talk about what goes where in incentive plans in terms of what metrics we would typically expect to see in which components. Talk about some of the important aspects of financial measure selection, inputs versus outputs, the alignment with value. No discussion on performance metrics would be complete without discussion on the difficulties and complexities of relative TSR measure. And then we'll finish with a little bit on judgment and discretion, which are two, I think, hugely important topics, but which are one of the most common reasons for remuneration committees getting themselves in unbearably hot water. But we go back to the sort of theory of executive pay. I mean, virtually every remuneration report would say it's about attracting, retaining, motivating, and aligning executives with investors. And indeed, this underpins a sort of standard academic model of pay by Holstrom and Milgram. Holstrom, one of the Nobel Prize winner last year for his work on incentive contracts. And basically, the sort of academic model says that you've got to pay your CEO just enough that they're paid more than their next best option. And you need to pay them for performance to, you know, encourage them to exert effort to increase the value of the company. The problem with that is that CEOs don't like that. So to the extent you pay them for effort, you have to pay them more. And there's a trade-off in that, you know, you've got to get the amount just right so that it's still more than their next best option, but not so much that the extra cost of pay for effort means that shareholder value is ultimately destroyed. And in this model, CEOs only care about pay for utility of consumption, for the extra car, house, boat, whatever it is that they want to buy. One of the other kind of aspects that come through from this model is that you really shouldn't expose CEOs to risks that they can't control, because any increase in risk in the package means that you have to pay more to compensate. So why would you do that? And that leads you to this model of relative performance evaluation being kind of broadly the optimal way to pay CEOs. But of course, you know, life, you know, reality doesn't always match up with the academic theory. And there are a number of dimensions to this which we'll touch on. One is that, you know, motivation isn't just financial. This idea that utility drives behavior is financial utility is not entirely true. Fairness is really important. There are a whole bunch of practical issues and constraints that boards face that theory just doesn't identify. Incentives can act against you as well as for you. And this is all happening now in an increasingly kind of high stakes game for incentive pay. And I'm just going to start on this whole thing around, you know, what really motivates people. Is it financial incentives? And this is just a snippet from some fascinating research, I would say so myself, but which I strongly encourage you to go and read, which was a survey paper that we did with Alex Edmonds of London Business School and Dirk Gentry of the LSE, where we interviewed over 200 board directors in FTSE companies and 150 investors in FTSE companies, just to try and get under the skin of how pay is set. And the motivation for this was coming into the academic world. Some of the models that were being used just seem to be utterly bonkers and not reflect, you know, kind of day-to-day realities that all of us sitting around here would identify. And so we thought we'd do this survey paper to try and get under the skin of some of these issues around how pay is set. And one of the findings here was that everybody overwhelmingly accepts that sort of intrinsic and personal motivations are incredibly important for senior executives, something which is largely ignored in the standard academic model of incentive pay. But, you know, incentives sort of do matter. They come a close third. And when we ask, well, why do you offer incentives? Obviously, part of it's about motivation. Part of it's about attracting a high ability or hard-working CEO. But there's this interesting factor, ranked third by a very high percentage of people, so that the CEO shares the risk with investors and stakeholders, even if outside of the CEO's control. And this is an immediate example about how real life doesn't always match up with academic reality, because of course this is inefficient risk sharing. Okay, we shouldn't be doing this, but of course everybody wants us to. And one of the things that came through very strongly, if you read the full paper, is this idea that actually financial motivations are really only one part of the picture when it comes to incentive pay. And fairness is an incredibly important dimension. Now, fairness is a word that people hate. And I remember one Remuneration Committee having proudly presented a paper on the importance of fairness in pay. The Remuneration Committee chair said, I never want the word fairness to be said in this Remuneration Committee ever again. It's a meaningless word. It doesn't, no one knows what it means. And there's an element of truth about that. It's a little bit like picking up a bar of soap in a bath. You think you've got it and then it escapes you. But it doesn't mean that it's not important. And there are many dimensions to fairness. And what the research brings out is that there's fairness from a CEO's perspective, which might be about how their peers are paid, how hard they feel they've had to work, the contribution they feel they've made. There's fairness from the employee's perspective about is there like-for-like treatment in the teeth of a pandemic. There's fairness from a shareholder's perspective. Of the value of our holding has fallen. How has the CEO's pay reflected that? And what we come across is this sort of importance of pay from a CEO's perspective as providing ex post recognition. It's not just the theoretical sort of upfront incentives to perform, communication of what's important. It's a sense that the outcome is fair and that performance has been recognised that is completely disconnected from financial utility of pay. And so this importance of fairness and recognition is really critical when we're designing incentives, and incentive systems that don't allow for that and provide the Remuneration Committee to reflect that ultimately do come unstuck. But on the other side of the equation, this doesn't mean that extrinsic motivations don't matter. Now, CEOs will always tell you that they don't think about their pay. Okay, so John Cryan famously said that I wouldn't, work any harder, I wouldn't do anything any differently if you didn't pay me a bonus. I've heard CEOs constantly say this. There is mountains of evidence that just disproves that. Okay, financial incentives matter. They affect behaviour. So we know that, for example, if you look at incentive payouts as clustering around thresholds and maxima. So people will do just enough to get over a threshold if they're about to miss it. When they hit a maximum, they pull back because they don't want to overshoot and have harder targets in subsequent years. There's research about companies just sort of deciding to cut R&D, when they've just met an earnings target, increasing discretionary accounting accruals. There's evidence that people will strategically release positive news around the point of stock option vesting and exercise events, all of these kind of things. And of course, fraud. So financial incentives matter, but so does intrinsic motivation. And not all of those extrinsic factors are actually negative. So actually people having a large, one of the sort of strange things about unfunded pensions, which you've all thought were a really bad thing, executives that have unfunded pensions, that creates higher credit quality in the companies that they run because they have an obvious incentive for the company not to go bust. Long-term stock ownership is positive for performance. Lengthening time horizons of pay improves performance and stakeholder outcomes. Within management structures, performance focus supported by executive pay, as the work of John Van Reenen has shown, is an indicator of higher economic performance, and is one of the things that is actually not present in the UK compared to many other top management countries like Sweden, the US, and Germany. So intrinsic motivations matter, but extrinsic motivations matter as well. So incentives work, but they're not the whole story. And for this reason, remuneration committees have a really kind of complex interplay of features that they need to take account of when designing incentives. And this is all happening in a world where the stakes have got enormously high. So if you go back to the mid-1990s, about 1/3 of the package was performance related. Okay, 1/3 was salary, 1/3 were these enormously valuable final salary pension schemes. Anyone remember 30th accelerated accrual? These things were unbelievably expensive, but bonuses and LTIs were rather low, and as a result of that, you could take the rough with the smooth. And in fact, if you go back in time, it was quite common. I remember when I started out in my career, which wasn't quite the mid-90s, it was the late 90s, it wasn't that unusual for a bonus to be zero, because the bonus might just have one target. It might just have the profit target because it was relatively small. Now we have a situation where performance pay is 2/3 of the total or more, and the stakes are enormous. The consequence has been it's become virtually unacceptable for a bonus to be zero. And we find all sorts of, increased metrics, balanced scorecards, goodness knows what, in effect to defray risk. And there's been this game of cat and mouse between investors and companies on that score. So we are placing a massive amount of pressure on the governance system around pay. Personally, I think it's a pressure that the governance system isn't really fit to bear, but we are where we are. And as a result of this, incentive packages have kind of become multidimensional compromises between different stakeholder interests. So we have to have this balance of sort of input and controllable metrics to make the CEO feel that there's fairness at play and that there's still, and that they're being fairly rewarded for their contribution and to provide incentivization. On the other hand, shareholders want results, so we still have to pay for that. And we do find that diversifying across a decent run of metrics avoids this sort of embarrassment of incentives paying out at zero and the CEO having a hissy fit. And the way that this typically gets put together is that the more controllable metrics get put in the short-term incentive plan and the more output-driven metrics get put in the long-term incentive plan. Although we're seeing that be diluted a little bit with the emergence of ESG metrics, although that's not a topic for today. But when it comes to financial metrics, this largely holds true. And there's some data just to back this up. We see that, in bonus metrics, qualitative measures rank second, and of course, and strategic measures are fairly prominent, whereas in long-term incentive plans, it is overwhelmingly TSR, financial measures, return measures. You know all of this, but this has been this sort of result of this kind of balance of conflicting kind of stakeholder objectives, executives versus shareholders, the stakes being so high, that has resulted in remuneration committees really managing multiple stakeholder perspectives through package design in a way that has arguably led to rather a lot of complexity. A little bit more on inputs versus outputs. And this is one thing that I think that companies and remuneration committees need to be very aware of. If we look at a very, very sort of simplified value tree as we go through sales, OPEX, CAPEX, through into accounting metrics, all the way across to TSR and relative TSR, a real sort of acronym soup that we have here. What we find is that there are elements of this value chain that are much more controllable than others. So in general, we all know, anyone that's started a business knows that the hardest thing to do is to get a customer that's prepared to pay you money, right? The easiest thing to do is to control your costs. So, in general, sales is much more difficult to control than OPEX and CAPEX. Equity issuance is the other thing that's, leverage in the company is another thing that's relatively controllable. And so what we see is that some of these metrics are much more controllable than others. And executives tend to like controllable metrics, okay? And that is a big battle for remuneration committees, because in this kind of balancing act between executives and shareholders, they need to give executives enough of what they want, otherwise everybody just gets very upset about everything all of the time, and that's very time consuming and sapping of energy. But on the other hand, shareholders have to be kept happy with the outputs, and actually understanding the extent to which financial metrics are or are not controllable is critical, and understanding how might this metric be met in a way that you might not fully have anticipated. And this is borne out in the data. So, for example, cash flow consistently pays out higher than revenue. Cash flow metrics in short and long-term incentive plans are amongst the highest paying, because actually everyone can manage cash flow at the end of the year by one way, shape or form. You can cut CAPEX, you can manage working capital. Boards hardly ever understand what management is doing on cash flow. You can actually mess around with the numbers on revenue, as retailers have famously shown in recent history, but it's much harder to, that's more a kind of a revenue recognition point. It's much harder to simply create sales out of nothing. Similarly, cash flow in LTIPs pays out a lot higher than relative TSR. One of the reasons why shareholders like relative TSR is its average payout rate is lower. We'll come back to it later, but it is much, much more difficult to mess around with the system on relative TSR than it is with some of these other measures. Return measures sort of famously were manipulated during the financial crisis, with banks running on ever thinner leverage in order to boost returns. So this point about controllability is something that I think you need a bit of it, because it's part of what motivates executives, but if you have too much of it, you end up hitting the target but missing the point. And I think this is something that any board should understand. So I think some sort of takeaways up to this point are that incentives in a way have become complicated because we're trying to meet multiple objectives in a very high stakes game. But we have to be realistic that that's where we are. We mustn't be too sort of coin operated in our view of incentives. It's not just about intrinsic motivation. Fairness really, really matters, but also incentives work. So we have to be really careful what we wish for. And we always need to ask the question, how could this be met in a way that I kind of wish it hadn't been met? Because there's a lot of evidence that that happens quite a lot of the time. What about alignment with value? I mean, clearly that's something that we should be trying to do with financial metrics, right? I mean, it sounds absolutely obvious, but it's much easier said than done. Now, value is something that we understand very well in theory, okay? So, Finance 101 is that value is created when the net present value of cash flows of the project is positive, and that adds to the value of the firm and what shareholders are prepared to pay for it. Equivalently, value is positive when the returns on a new project exceed the cost of capital. So far, so good. Most of the most commonly used measures are not directly aligned with value according to this definition, and actually it's very difficult to do, as we'll see. But I mean, the two most common financial measures by far are earnings per share and return on capital employed. What's interesting is that these measures are incredibly kind of common and actually largely accepted by shareholders, despite each of them having, on the face of it, quite profound problems. The EPS problem is that the threshold for a project being EPS additive is too low. It's basically the cost of debt. Provided you invest in a way that exceeds the cost of debt, you will add to EPS. Equally, if you're doing a share buyback, provided that your cost of interest is above 1 over your PE ratio, you will be earnings accretive, EPS accretive if you do a share buyback. These are not equated with adding to the net present value of the firm. So EPS can encourage you to overinvest or to be too willing to buy back shares. By contrast, ROCE has a different set of problems. ROCE can set the bar too high, because if you have a ROCE measure, then in effect, the hurdle rate for improving your average ROCE is the current average ROCE, right? So your incremental project needs to be the current average ROCE in order to increase it. If you invest in a project that's above your cost of capital, but below your current average ROCE, you'll reduce your average ROCE. This creates all sorts of problems when you have companies with historic balance sheet issues, where you might have very high legacy returns because you have depreciated balance sheet holdings. And so this leads to the risk of underinvestment. A lot of companies get around this by just bunging both in the mix and hoping that they kind of balance out a little bit. But we need to be aware of these incentives, and it doesn't always matter, because actually, provided we understand the behavior that we're expecting, what the business strategy says about how we're going to grow earnings and how we're going to grow returns, then when we come to judgment and discretion at the end of the day, we can ask, have these measures been enhanced in the ways that we expected according to the strategy? What we need to be really careful of is that we don't have a strategy that assumes we're going to improve earnings or ROCE in a particular way, and then find they've been improved in a completely different way that has actually destroyed value but enhanced the measure. So one way through this is to come up with a better measure. And there's been a whole industry of coming up with better measures to capture value. And I'm just going to talk about one of them, which is economic profit, but cash flow return on investment. I mean, there are all sorts of equivalents to these. And so, what some clever clogs come along and do is they say, well, this is easy to solve. So earnings per share encourages overinvestment. Return on capital encourages underinvestment. Let's come up with a measure that solves the problem of both of these, and is the answer to all of our dreams. And economic profit is that measure. So economic profit is defined as, in essence, profit, so NOPAT is net operating profit after tax, less a charge for the capital deployed to create that profit. So profit less your invested capital times a weighted average cost of capital. So why is this such a fantastic measure? So remember what we said before. Any project adds value if it increases the net present value of the cash flows of the firm, or equivalently, if it generates returns above the cost of capital. So if I now have an incremental project that creates returns above the cost of capital, that means that it will have increased NOPAT on the left by more than it's increased the term on the right, the invested capital times the WACC. So automatically, no matter what my current return on capital is, I will improve EP if I deliver a project that exceeds my weighted average cost of capital. Conversely, any project that just exceeds my cost of debt and so would enhance EPS, but which doesn't exceed my weighted average cost of capital, that will actually reduce economic profit. Job done. And there was a whole industry of firms that grew up around economic profit methodologies. The problem is, with all of these kind of financial proxies for value, I think it's kind of like threefold. One is that any financial metric is looking backwards, whereas value is inherently forward-looking. I think the second problem is that you get lost in this world of adjustments, because all of these measures still rely on certain kind of accounting and balance sheet items. And all of these problems around historic balance sheet depreciation and so on and so forth come into play. And so what you end up doing if you go down these routes is getting into debates about, should you be capitalizing research and development? Should you be adjusting historic balance sheet values? What do you do about this, that, and the other? And finally, there is in practice a lack of alignment between these measures and traditional management reporting, which tends to be based on traditional accounting metrics. So what happens is economic profit becomes something that just lives in the incentive plan until 3 years later, everybody gets out the manual and says, what did we say about how this thing was defined, and calculates the outcome. So for that reason, economic profit has generally died out in organizations unless a massive effort is put in to restructuring the whole of the decision-making and reporting processes within the firm. So it largely falls into the nice in theory bucket. Another nice in theory answer is relative total shareholder return. And again, that really should be the answer, because, and this is really the Holstrom-Milgram answer, which is to say, you know, we strip out all of the stuff that was outside of the CEO's control and we access the excess performance, which is their performance of their stock relative to a peer group. And it sounds like really beautiful, this, because you say, look, why should you get paid if you haven't outperformed the median of your peers? And of course, if you're in the top quartile, you should get the maximum. So that sounds great, and it kind of is great over one cycle, but when you start looking at this stuff over multiple cycles, it absolutely breaks down. And these relative TSR schemes reward volatility of performance more than they reward sustained outperformance. Companies that crash around between the top and between last place and first place, you know, do really well out of these schemes. Companies that consistently come in just above median do rather poorly. Choosing peer groups is really, really difficult with so many different factors of comparability that need to be tested. And the difficulty with peer groups and availability of information are the main reasons why directors don't use relative measures as much as theory would suggest. I mean, a couple of examples of the sort of way in which this can go wrong. Many of you will have had this debate. Should you use an index or a peer group ranking? So a couple of examples here. BHP, the mining company, 75% miner, 25% oil and gas. What do you do about that, right? There's no other company that has that product mix. Okay, well, what you do is you construct your own index, which is 75% weighted of miners, 25% oil and gas. So that sounds fantastic. You've created a proxy BHP. The problem is that the leverage of all of those miners is massively higher than BHP, so the whole index crashes around much more than BHP's share price. Tesco tried a similar thing when they were 85% food and 15% general retailer, much more general retailer than the other food retailers. So they created their own proxy index, which included a blended mix of general and food retailers. Until they bought Booker, and sort of the index kind of ate itself and no one knew really how to deal with that or cope with that. Both of these organizations reverted to traditional ranking measures, and these sort of proxy index measures tend to die on their own complexity and unintended consequences, and generally ranking proves more durable. But any of these relative TSR measures tends to be very problematic because executives don't manage to relative TSR. There's a sense of lottery and unfair outcomes, this word fairness coming in again, and this fact that actually many directors and investors think that it's fair for executives to share in an industry upswing or suffer in an industry downswing, and they don't actually like the fact necessarily that relative performance measures strip all of this out. So I'm going to finish up now on some stuff on kind of below the line items, judgment and discretion. This is a major source of shareholder disquiet. Shareholder hate adjusted measures that are used for pay. Here's a little example. Bradford Bingley's EPS progression between 2003 and 2006 on a statutory and underlying basis, strong underlying growth, statutory decline. We all know how it ended. There's great skepticism in the investor community that these underlying measures just strip out stuff that is just not flattering to companies, and hide, the reality of the trajectory of company performance. And there are some real challenges with one-offs and impairments. So there's this point around kind of fairness versus optics. And when I was advising RBS in 2013, they suffered a £9 billion loss, which was the third largest loss in corporate history. And one of the others was RBS themselves a few years before. And none of the management team there at the time, of course, had anything to do with this. And so from a sort of management accountability point of view, you say, well, it's absurd to do anything on bonuses because of this impairment. But on the other hand, you look at the optics and the idea that RBS would dole out a whole load of bonuses funded by the taxpayer in the year when they made the third largest loss in corporate history, clearly not credible. So there's often an optics point about impairment, but a real problem with allocating performance accountability. We've also got the fact that formulaic approaches often fall down because an impairment is fundamentally a multi-year profit impact brought forward into 1 year. So I do have a lot of sympathy for exclusion of impairments, but it needs very careful communication. And one thing that I think it definitely needs is consistency of treatment. So I have seen an absolute horror story where an impairment was included as an exceptional for the purposes of the return, but was allowed to impair the balance sheet for the purposes of the capital employed, and therefore massively boosted return on capital employed. So there are consistency and fairness points that need to be thought about very, very carefully. The negative items over time and between the P&L and balance sheet. And this point on positive and negatives is really critical, because I think too often adjustment processes run at the end of the year with management coming to remuneration committees with a list of all sorts of things that should be excluded, but no sense of process and balance around what's going to be considered and what the ins and outs are. So I think some of that governance is really critical, which sort of brings me on to judgment versus discretion. I think it's really vital for remuneration committees to have both judgment and discretion. What do I mean by these? Judgment to me is interpretation of an input to a formula. So this might be adjusting an EPS measure for an acquisition. So you're still using the formula, you're still using the measure, but you're recognizing that some event has distorted that measure in a way that you didn't anticipate. And what you're doing is you're making an adjustment that puts the measure back in line with the original intent. Discretion is more where the formula's just produce an answer that just isn't right in the circumstances. So that might be the RBS example with the impairment. It might be a sort of a health and safety incident in an organization. AstraZeneca would argue that it might be the fact that Pascal Soriot saved the world with the COVID-19 vaccine, which therefore demanded an uplift to his bonus in 2020. And I think it's important to understand the difference between these two, but also to have relevant processes around them. And the most important to me is that I think there needs to be a comprehensive process of Remco review of all items, positive and negative, right? There has to be, BHP do this very well actually, they have a default process that excludes exceptionals, but the Remco has to go through every single one, positive and negative, and confirm whether or not it should be included. You need to refer back to the original intent of the measure, obviously, and look at the overall fairness of outcomes, but it's particularly critical, I think, that we kind of meet these principles of balance. So you're looking at positives and negatives, consistency over time and between different KPIs, but also transparency. So the remuneration committees really understand, so that investors really understand why and how you have done this. And an example of kind of where this goes wrong, I'm not going to name this company, but they had an operating cash flow measure in their incentives that sort of excluded all of this sort of bad below the line stuff. And there was a year where this operating cash flow measure, even though it's meant to be a kind of underlying measure, somehow, according to the formula, benefited from a whole load of non-recurring kind of tax and asset revaluation items, which meant that it magically paid out when profits had fallen 20%. The Remuneration Committee judgment allowed these non-recurring items to stand, and they didn't apply discretion to reduce the bonus. And shareholders just went kind of nuts because they just said, you've got to be joking. You've created this parallel universe in which executives have done well, when manifestly, they have not. And so this is an area where REMCOs can get it really wrong by not applying it, as well as by applying it. So just to finish up this kind of canter around, we need to be aware that incentives work, right? And sometimes we'll wish they didn't. And all of this stuff about how, CEOs are entirely intrinsically motivated, is just not true. And so it's really important to sort of think about how might this metric be met, particularly given the large stakes that we now have in incentive pay, and scenario testing, downside analysis, how might this be met in a way you wouldn't expect, and what would you do? Having said that, this whole point around fairness is still really, really important and mustn't be ignored. Judgment and discretion need to be considered separately and need to have a very clear and structured process to take in positive and negative items. But across all of this stuff around pay, there is no magic bullet. I mean, I have to say, I think we have created an infrastructure through hoping for too much from target-driven pay, driving the quantums of variable pay up too high. I'm less concerned actually about total quantum of pay than I am about the proportion that's variable pay. And that does lead, in my mind, to attractions around simplification, restricted stock. I know people have very different views on this, but I do think that we have loaded so much into a system that we have overstretched the ability of that system and governance system to bear it. This makes our lives difficult, frankly, and it makes the Remuneration Committee's lives difficult. But to some degree, we are where we are. And I hope at least I've highlighted some of the issues that you as HR professionals and boards should be taking into account when addressing this thorny issue. Thank you.